Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jonathan Crush on migration and development. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Wolseley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I'm pleased to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, who is an expert on some aspect of global governance or international public policy. This week I'm pleased to welcome my new colleague, Jonathan Crush, who's the CIGI Chair of Global Migration and Development at the Wolseley School and a noted expert on international migration. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, David.
I've had two of your colleagues on recently, Margaret Walton-Roberts and also Alison Mounts, and we've had two conversations about migration-related issues. Both of those have been sort of global south to global north migration discussions. And so I'm particularly interested in the opportunity to speak to you today about sort of global south to global south migration. But before we get to that, actually, I'd like to ask you to let us know a little bit more about the nexus between migration and development, because that is also a connection that I didn't speak to in detail with Margaret and Alison. I know people tend to study migration or people tend to study development, but the combination of the two, I imagine, is probably not a terribly common thing.
Yes, it's David. It's not simply that people study one or the other, but if you move from the research arena into the policy area, you tend to see the same division replicated, very separate silos, development as a policy issue, and migration as a policy issue. And the challenge, therefore, both for researchers and for policymakers, is to try and think through ways of putting these two issues together, because in fact they are, in reality, integrally connected.
Mm-hmm. And we often do think of development-related problems as one of the spurs for migration, so that's an intuitive link. What about the other way around? Is migration a challenge for development, or is it as often as not an opportunity for development?
Well, there has been a traditional view that development is something that will stop migration. And this is a very popular view, certainly in the 1990s. And one still sees it in many policy forums. The idea that migration per se is not a good thing, particularly uncontrolled migration. And therefore, if one could in fact address the root causes, which are actually seen as an absence of development, then migration itself would be dampened down. And one still sees that kind of view articulated, I think, particularly in the European context. But by and large, researchers have contested that sort of view. First, by taking issue with the notion that migration is necessarily a bad thing for development. And secondly, by suggesting that there's no simple connection between level of development and migration. In other words, you could get high levels of development and also high levels of migration.
In fact, if you're just talking about population mobility, there's probably more migration in the rich countries of the world than the poor countries of the world. People are often very mobile, moving cross-country or transcontinentally to take up new opportunities.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I think that's true on a global scale
as well. We
as
just don't call it migration, do we?
Well, you don't call it migration, no. But I think it's the middle classes, the skilled globally, who have a kind of mobility which is denied to many who actually would want to migrate. I mean, I was looking recently at the Gallup survey, which was done between 2007 and 2009 on intentions to migrate around the world. And it's clear that, at least from their findings, that if I get the figure correctly, about 700 million people would actually like to leave the country where they live and to move. They then have some rather strange maps which show that if people could move where they wanted to move, they would all leave the south and end up in the north. There's a big difference between what you would like to do and what's actually possible to do. And in reality, there is tremendous mobility actually within the South, both internal to countries and across borders. But it's not that kind of global perspective that you might see from the middle classes and the skilled.
Right. Now, how do you approach this migration development nexus in your own research? What sort of disciplinary lenses do you bring? What sort of tools do you use to study this particular connection?
I come myself from a background in development studies. I have had a long-standing interest in development, what actually it is and how you define it and how you talk about it. And on the other hand, a lot of my research per se has been on mobility and movement going well back to the earlier parts of my career. I think that in terms specifically of your question, one of the problems that one confronts in researching migration is that the researchers tend to focus either on countries of origin or countries of destination. And my view is that you don't get a whole picture of what's actually happening unless you do both. And that, of course, is quite a challenge.
And probably in many cases, countries of transition also.
Well, I certainly think you can't assume that someone disappears from one place and then ends up in another. One would certainly have to look at those routes and corridors, as they're increasingly called. My own interests really relate to what I would call the implications of absence. In other words, what actually does it mean for the family, the household, the community, the region of a country, the nation itself, when a person is actually not there for periods of time. And the conventional view, really up until about 10 years ago, was that this was bad for all, a negative. And what one sees, I think, in the last 10 years is a rethinking of that, and actually saying that really, if you look at it very carefully, it's a mixed blessing, actually.
Well, let's follow that up in a moment when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's talk a little bit about the governance architecture of the issues you're interested in studying in particular. What is the state of play with governance on migration, south-to-south migration in particular, that you're interested in? Is this something that's badly governed, just woefully undergoverned, governed in an Apache way?
Patchy, I would say, David, definitely. But in a state of rapid transition. I mean, if you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I probably just would have looked glum and not said very much.
Right.
But what there's really been over the last 10 years is a really serious attempt to construct a global architecture. And a lot of this comes out of the UN, and I think Kofi Annan in particular is not given enough credit for his initiatives in this area. I think one can say that he was certainly a motivating force behind the Global Commission on International Migration, which reported in 2005. And that commission, I know it was actually extremely important in terms of its recommendations and its thinking about the issues. But what's significant about it is that it took place outside the UN system. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of opposition, actually. And I think the North and the South are on opposite sides of the fence on this, to actually taking on board the migration issue as a central governance question within the United Nations as a whole. One saw this in what then followed the Global Commission on International Migration, which was the first ever UN high-level dialogue on international migration and development. And a lot of the countries in the South were articulating a vision, one, that there was a necessity to see these things together, but secondly, the UN really needed to move forward on this particular question. Whereas a lot of countries in the North, Europe, the States, Canada as well, were kind of adamant that migration stay out of the UN.
For fear that their own sovereign prerogatives would be
I think
eroded?
that's a fundamental issue. It is, as one might anticipate, a question which, particularly in the 1990s, had caused a lot of conflict, actually. I think just the very term brain drain, for example, would raise hackles all over the place. And so I think that anything that was going to be binding was not something that countries in the North were particularly interested in. And so it kind of went offshore for a while into what has become actually a very successful annual meeting called the Global Forum for Migration and Development. It's a voluntary, non-binding, participatory forum. It meets in alternate years in the North and in the South. In 2012, the meeting will be in Mauritius, first time in Africa. It's attended by representatives of most states, North and South. It tends to identify particular themes. I've just seen the concept paper for the 2012 forum. And they'll be focusing on 2 or 3 major themes. It has a very practical orientation, presentations, roundtables, and so forth. So what this has done, I think, is provided a forum for kind of non-conflictual discussion.
Are there civil society actors involved in this also, NGOs?
Well,
or no?
that's an interesting question, because right from the beginning, the group of states called the Friends of the Forum wanted this participation. And governments were not terribly keen, I have to say. So the outcome of that has been that civil society has its days. So the first couple of days of the Global Forum, civil society comes, organizations from around the world. They then produce a report which is presented to the state representatives. But they don't come en masse into those sessions. So there's still this divide between governments and civil society. There's also a concern, I think, that civil society itself is not represented in all its fullness.
But which of the civil society actors tend to be the most active on this issue?
I would say in general it tends to be human rights groups and migrant organizations. And so the whole discourse that one sees in civil society tends to be around the rights of migrants and the denial thereof by states. Now you can see why states themselves are actually not that comfortable having that kind of discourse brought into the state sessions. Labour is there, not perhaps as represented as it might be, and business is curiously absent so far. What this has done, I think, apart from anything else, is changed the whole landscape around the way in which this relationship is actually thought by states. And I think it's very encouraging that the net result is that next year, 2013, there'll actually be a second UN high-level dialogue.
And when you have a constructive and, I gather, polite conversation in this forum, it makes one wonder why the UN as a whole can't take it up and have a constructive and polite discussion in that forum.
Well, I think this is the other side of it. The UN, of course, is made up of a number of different agencies. And what one has seen over the course of the last 5 or 6 years is that one by one, these different agencies have actually taken up in one way or another the migration issue, put it fairly high on their agenda. So you name an agency. Like
the UNDP and the
UNHCR, UNESCO, UNICEF, not the FAO, and for reasons that we could talk about.
I'd very much like to do that in a moment when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off.
Yeah, sure.
So I am surprised that the FAO is not very active on the migration file, and so perhaps you could say a little bit more about that. And I also wonder if the fact that sort of all these different functional agencies of the UN are sort of doing their own little thing with respect to migration, whether that results in them working at cross purposes with each other or duplications or redundancies, and whether there might not be some thought given to creating some sort of central agency, I suppose, at the UN to deal with it.
Well, you're thinking like they do, in fact, because that's what's happened.
Oh, I see.
I think there was a realization that, first of all, there was a lack of coordination, a lot of enthusiasm in the different agencies, particularly in UNDP. Of course, the 2009 Human Development Report was actually on the issue of migration, but also a way of engaging as agencies with those other international agencies outside the UN who really had a very strong brief on migration development issues. And I think particularly of the World Bank and also of the International Organization for Migration. And of course, both of those are outside the UN. So there was a need for some kind of coordinating forum that was created a couple of years ago, and they call themselves the GMG, Global Migration Group. So a lot of these UN agencies are represented in the Global Migration Group, and the WHO is there, and the IOM, and the World Bank.
Is this more of a bureaucratic organization, or is it a technocratic one, or some sort of mix of the two?
I think it's still in the process of defining its role, but I would say that it's trying to be technocratic. In the best sense of that word.
So reaching out to the scholarly community and trying to leverage the best scholarship.
Well, I think there's two directions of reaching out. One is towards states themselves, because it's all very well to say to a state, migration and development are connected, and that your migration, your development planning completely ignores the fact that 30 or 40% of your population is absent at any one time. So the word that tends to be used is mainstreaming. So there's been this kind of rhetorical call to mainstream migration into development planning, and to think about migration as a development issue. So that's the mainstreaming of development into migration. How do you do it?
And this is how the upside that you were talking about earlier feeds in.
Exactly.
What is the upside? How do you cast the golden light on migration when you're coming to talk about development challenges?
Well, my own view is that you do it quite selectively. In other words, you tend to focus on areas which are not contentious. And you, in a sense, skate over areas of contention. And so one tends to find within this discussion a sort of recurrent set of themes, which are not contentious, or were contentious and are not anymore. So, for example, if we take this whole issue of the brain drain. Now, I mean, even fairly sober scholars on the one side would say, and I've seen phrases like this in recent writing, that the North is poaching or looting skills from the South. In a great brain robbery was another phrase. This has even been called in, I think, in one of the top British medical journals recently, an international crime. So what does this debate have to do about that? And I think what's actually happened is, although the South is still very concerned about the fact that they're losing all their doctors and skilled professionals and so on, the migration development discourse says, well, look, these people aren't an absolute loss. They move, they become high earners, they remit large portions of their salary, and that itself then is actually mitigates some of the negative impacts. So I'm just simply trying to say that even those formerly contentious issues have been recast and this is now about, it's a discussion about diasporas and diaspora engagement.
Right. In fact, I guess remittances would be the one area where one could say the most positive things about migration, because it would, in theory at least, sort of promote global equality economically, reduce transaction costs for productive interactions between poorer countries and richer countries, generate social capital between rich countries and poor countries.
Yes, all of those things. I think, though, that there was a hint right at the beginning of this discussion about remittances and their significance, because when the World Bank, actually, the IMF began to actually gather central figures and show quite how significant the flow of remittances was. Some said, well, this is actually a form of development aid, and therefore the implication being, we can scale back on actually development aid because remittances are doing it. Fortunately, that particular argument was stopped dead in its tracks, actually, by countries in the South who said these are two separate issues. Right. There is a debate about remittances and their kind of developmental impact. We've done a lot of work ourselves in our project on remittances within the South, particularly from South Africa to neighboring states. Mm-hmm. And the question comes up, when people are remitting primarily to household and family members, and doing so really just to meet basic needs, is that developmental or not? So that's the discussion.
Very good. We'll be back once more with Jonathan Crush. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's talk a bit about some of your own specific research projects. Okay. And I understand that last year you published a book called Zimbabwe's Exodus with the IDRC, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Tell us a bit about the book and what you were trying to do with it and what you found.
Yes, okay. This is, the subtitle is actually quite important as well. We were trying, I think, in the title to get some kind of notion of the scale of the movement out of an imploding state in Africa, Zimbabwe. But the subtitle is Crisis, Migration, Survival. And there was it was prompted in some sense by a well-known journalist actually in South Africa who was complaining about the policies of the ANC government towards Zimbabwe, saying they weren't tough enough. And making the point that there were 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa already as migrants, fleeing this economic collapse. And that if the government didn't do something about it, then another 3 million would pour in, this is the words used, pour into South Africa. And first of all, there were a couple of problems with that. One was there's absolutely no evidence that there were 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. But secondly, it really took migration itself out of the equation. Because if you look at the situation in Zimbabwe, and I often carry around with me $1 trillion Zimbabwean note, which
what would that buy?
Like 3/4 of a loaf of bread.
Oh, really?
I mean, it was astonishing. This is 2008. 2008. So the question was then, why didn't everybody leave Zimbabwe? I mean, you've got a population, 11, 12 million. Most researchers would say at most you've got 1 to 1.5 million outside the country. And the missing dimension there was actually migration itself, because migration is both caused by this economic implosion, but in some sense it shields those who remain from the worst effects through remittances.
Right.
So there was absolutely no justification for saying that another 3 million would pour in. They were being kept in place and kept alive by the remittances from family members who'd actually left the country. So that was really what we're trying to get at with this subtitle. Yes, it's a huge, unprecedented crisis. It's produced migration, but in turn, that's allowed for the survival of those who remain.
Now, if you sort of map out the causal arrows in Zimbabwe, I imagine some people would say this migration really isn't a development-related effect, that the real cause of this would be mismanagement, corruption, state failure, not development or lack of it per se.
Well, I think if you look at Zimbabwe in the 1980s, you'd have to say there was a very strong development agenda and project. And it was very successful in many ways. Very costly, but in terms of a whole set of basic indicators, health, education, and so on, marvelously successful. But that unravels in the 1990s, and then after 2000 collapses altogether. So in a sense, it's migration which is the result of the failure of a development project, I would say. Yeah.
And other work you've done includes work on food security. What's the migration development angle to the study of food security?
Well, I mentioned earlier on that the FAO is not part of the Global Migration Group, and so one has to ask the question, why is that? And it's a question I can't answer satisfactorily, except to say that there does seem to be this massive disjuncture, institutional disjuncture and research disjuncture between these two major issues which are on the global development agenda: migration on the one hand and food security on the other. And they exist in these kind of separate realms, and they hardly talk to each other at all. And one of the things I would like to do in this new position, which I have here, is to try and build a dialogue between these two areas. And
is it perhaps because so many of the food security people look at food security through a market lens? It's basically an economic issue, and the question is how to make sure that markets work efficiently for the global supply of adequate food. So you don't tend to think of migration inherently as an economic issue, something that would be governed better by market mechanisms. Maybe it's that sort of mindset disjuncture?
well, I think you're being probably a little generous to the food security people. I don't see a discussion and consideration of markets at this point as actually being terribly central. I mean, if you look at what the international agencies, FAO, some of our donor governments, including our own, and some of the big philanthropic foundations such as Gates are doing, they have this conceptualization of what some have called like Merry Africa, romanticization of rural Africa. The notion that all of Africa's poor are rural, and that it's there that the whole food crisis is being, or food insecurity crisis is being felt most keenly. And the solution to that is to rehabilitate smallholder agriculture. And of course, I would say large amounts of money are currently being put into this essentially technocratic effort to get smallholders to feed themselves. Well, where does migration fit into that? Well, it doesn't seem to actually have a conceptual place. But of course, the reality is that up and down the continent, most rural households have purchase a good proportion of their food, and they do so with remittances that they receive from migrant family members who have gone to the towns or gone to another country and so on. So that's, to me, is a gaping conceptual difficulty which needs to be addressed. The other one is that Africa and the South generally are urbanizing at a tremendous rate. And the whole issue of how the cities are going to be fed is really not being addressed terribly well.
Not through local smallholder agriculture, of course.
That is an argument that I would make, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your time and expertise with us.
Okay.
I and the audience appreciate it. To the audience, we appreciate you joining us, and please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.